Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for braving the weather and putting your problem-finding abilities to challenge, finding this room in this building. I'm sure if anybody had a similar challenge to me, well done. So, I'd just like to say a few words to set the scene for our speakers, our speakers being Fergus Harradence from BEIS and Rob Driscoll from ECA. The background to this is ECA has been working with BEIS looking at the implications of Brexit for our sector, for the construction sector, particularly actually in the context of no deal, but not exclusively. Along the way in those discussions, we identify that we really need to share some of this information with members. It would be very useful to do so. That's what today's event is all about. Now, I know today is a big day for Brexit, and potentially this week is a big week for Brexit. But we don't really want to go too far into the wider politics of this. We want to keep our debate focused on the implications for the construction sector. I think Fergus may talk a little bit about the options and the process, but it really is about the implications for the construction sector. So what's going to happen is Fergus will speak first, and I should thank him because I know his time is very precious, as you can imagine, at the moment with this on the agenda. Fergus is going to talk about the parliamentary process and the options, the key issues that arise for construction as a part of that process, and what's available from the government by way of help to firms in dealing with those issues. That will be followed by Rob, and Rob is going to talk about those issues in a little more detail, again specifically to the construction sector, and start to talk about how we can manage and mitigate some of the risks and issues that are arising. After those two presentations, we will have the opportunity for a questions and answer session. So you will get the chance to ask questions on certainly the construction bit, maybe the process more widely. But I do make the plea to you. It is a potentially emotive subject. We couldn't afford security today, so I don't want it to get too feisty. So in the Q&A, if we can keep it focused on the construction aspects of it specifically, we'd much appreciate it. We'll aim to finish by 4 o'clock. Hopefully that aligns with everybody's timetable. And it'll be up to you in the Q&A session, hopefully, to make the most of the event. So without any further ado, Fergus, if I could hand over to you to do your presentation.
Sure. Okay. My name is Fergus Harradence. I'm the Deputy Director for Construction in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And as Steve said, what I was going to do today is try and give you a little bit of background to what's going on in relation to Brexit, the parliamentary process and the key votes this week, and also some of the work that we've been doing to help the industry to prepare for various possible Brexit outcomes. All of this comes with the caveat today that if I was giving this talk in 6 hours' time, it might be different. If I was giving this talk in 24 hours' time, it would almost certainly be different. As it would potentially be in 48 hours' time, 72 hours' time, and a week's time. I'm afraid there is nothing much I can do about that. So this is very much a snapshot in time, and my disclaimer is that anything that I say could be instantly disproved at the whim of Parliament, which is something I suppose civil servants are used to, but not the rest of the country. Just by way of background, I think it's worth saying the last 2.5 years have been a really challenging period for the government and for British politics as a whole. This is due to a combination of the complexity of the issues and the scope of the negotiation that we've had to conduct, the fact that we've had shifting deadlines and priorities and views amongst various people involved in this, the fact that it's been conducted in very emotive terms, and it has been the high-profile issue that's dominated the headlines for the last 2.5 years. And also, it's actually seen some quite seismic shifts in the way in which politics is conducted in this country. It's certainly true to say that in my entire 20-year career, I've never seen a parallel situation where you've had the system of whipping, party discipline, break down in the way that it has over Brexit, including most recently to the point where a group of MPs from the two main political parties went and formed a third party, something which hasn't happened since the 1970s. And beyond that as well as being used to a situation where parties are generally able to whip their MPs to vote in particular ways, we've had a situation where we've had various ministers in government to all intents and purposes, breaching the ministerial code in terms of what they've said and the public positions that they've taken, which have departed from official government policy, which, in theory at least, they're not supposed to be doing. The fact is they've done it because they regard this issue of such significance and they feel so strongly about it. So it is really changing the way in which politics is done, and new relationships and new groupings are forming in a way that we haven't seen since at least the 1970s, and actually a better parallel might be going back to something like the 18th and 19th century in terms of the way in which Parliament works and the dynamics within it. If we move on to where we are at this point in time, on the 15th of January, Parliament rejected the government's first attempt to get the withdrawal agreement through. The main issue that was cited by the majority MPs was obviously the backstop in Northern Ireland. There's since then been a period of subsequent negotiations which resulted in a new set of proposals being put forward last night. These are essentially 5 things, 3 big ones, 2 smaller ones. The 3 big things are, firstly, the withdrawal agreement that was negotiated last year and put to the vote on the 15th of January, which sets out the UK's divorce bill, if you like, the £39 billion, the rules under which it will operate during the transitional period, the duration of that, how things will work during that period. This is the formal legal agreement that would exist between the UK and the EU and hasn't been changed as a result of any of these negotiations. Separate to that, there is something called a political declaration, which sets out effectively people's aspirations for the nature of the future relationship between the UK and the EU. And then finally, the new thing which was agreed last night was what we're calling the joint interpretive instrument, which is an attempt to provide some assurances around the backstop. It stresses that it's supposed to be temporary, but it doesn't replace it or change it, and it doesn't include guarantees about the end date of the backstop or give the UK the unilateral right to withdraw from it, which were some of the key issues that had cropped up during the previous debates on this. And then it also creates an arbitration mechanism which would effectively prevent the EU from acting in bad faith and seeking to lock the UK into the backstop mechanism in perpetuity. And there were 2 smaller things that were also agreed, which was an agreement between both sides to work on technical solutions to the Irish border question, so the idea that you could have some form of technology that obviates the need for any sort of hard border infrastructure, and trying to conclude this by 2020. And also the government promised to make a UK unilateral statement on how it would interpret the joint instrument. This is actually common practice by countries in relation to all sorts of international treaties, but it is clearly simply their view. It's not necessarily agreed by the other side. It does not bind the other side. So it would effectively be a statement of the government's approach to it. And that leaves us with the big question, which will be answered tonight, which is whether MPs will see these changes as sufficient to persuade them to vote for the deal in sufficiently large numbers. And bear in mind what that means in practice is a sufficient number of MPs changing their minds that they overturn the result of the previous vote, which was 432 against versus 202 for, or in simpler terms, the biggest defeat a government in Britain has ever suffered in Parliament, ever. So at this point in time, given some of the recent statements that have been made about it from the European Research Group and also the Democratic Unionist Party, personally I would say it is quite hard to see that this is going to be agreed this evening. So it might happen. People might change their minds this afternoon. I'm sure there'll be frantic activity over the next few hours of people being called, dragged into corners, bullied, threatened, cajoled, persuaded, promised things, and everything else that we're all familiar with in relation to the way politics is conducted. And we will see what happens. But at this point, I think it is quite hard to see the withdrawal agreement being agreed by Parliament, which leads to the question of what happens next. On the assumption that the deal is rejected, then tomorrow there will be a second crucial deal, which would be Parliament voting on whether or not a no-deal Brexit would be an acceptable outcome. Again, I think it's quite hard to see, if you just do the parliamentary arithmetic, how that could MPs would vote in favour of that when so many, including government ministers, have consistently said they would block it. So on the assumption that a no-deal outcome is ruled out, you would then move to a third vote on Thursday, which is whether or not to seek an extension to Article 50, which even if MPs chose to vote in favour of that, would still leave a number of questions open as to for what duration, for what purpose, what would you do with and what would you do with the period that you get, assuming that the EU is willing to agree to an extension of the duration which the UK requests. And bear in mind that under the rules of set by the European treaties in relation to Article 50, the UK has to request an extension to Article 50. The EU cannot formally offer one. So the UK would have to move first and would have to make a proposal. This proposal would then have to be agreed by the European Commission and all of the member states individually. And whether or not they would do that, I think, would be influenced by the nature of the proposal and what they see on the table in front of them. My expectation would be that that request would have to be made at the latest by the time of the European Council meeting, which is on Friday the 22nd of March, so a week on Friday, when Theresa May will have to sit down with all of the other heads of government within the EU and explain what her plans are and what she wants to happen next, and make any bids, which could be for a short extension to Article 50 if, say, the withdrawal agreement is passed, or it could be a request for a much longer extension. We will just have to see what happens. The question of what exactly is going to be asked for, I think, will have to be informed by the votes and the debates that occur in Parliament this week, and potentially votes on other possible outcomes that could happen next week. I think we all know what the potential options are, so I won't dwell on those. But in theory, you would see, I think, if this withdrawal agreement is voted down, it may be not taken off the table completely, but put into abeyance while they explored other options, which could be remaining in the customs union, remaining in the single market, a second referendum, or potentially a general election at some point in the future. The big problem that the EU has got, as well as the proximate deadline for agreeing something with Europe, the 29th of March, because if we agree nothing with the EU by that point, by virtue of the operation of UK law and the fact that we triggered Article 50, we do leave the EU, then I think you still have a problem from the European perspective, because on the 18th of April, the European Parliament dissolves for the European elections. Shortly after that, this Commission will in effect dissolve. It will go into caretaker mode, because this is one of those years where the entire political furniture of the European Union moves around. So you'll have parliamentary elections with the new parliament taking its seats, I think it's June. And then after that, you will have a fairly drawn-out process for appointing a new president of the European Commission, and then nominating and confirming all of the European commissioners. So it is quite hard to see how, if the UK cannot leave the European Union by round about the end of April, you could actually agree anything much before the end of the year or the beginning of next year, simply because on the other side of the table there won't be anyone to negotiate with for quite some time. So the process of commission formation tends to take a few months. You'd expect the commissioners to be taking their seats and confirmed in their post probably by about October this year. So I think the essential message is, unless the withdrawal agreement is voted through, which confers a degree of certainty on what happens next, essentially all bets are off, and it's quite likely that you will face a prolonged period of uncertainty with all of the potential economic consequences of that. I don't want to be appallingly pessimistic about it, but I'm afraid that is the reality of the situation, and it's very difficult to see how you could provide certainty other way unless you make the assumption that Parliament will of its own volition revoke Article 50. But those are really the binary options about how you create certainty, or a degree of certainty, over the months ahead. So in terms of what we've been doing through the Construction Leadership Council to help firms prepare, with a focus on no-deal Brexit, because this seems the greatest risk. We held a conference which brought together about 150 people from across the industry. And it's not just the contracting sector. We had the construction product sector, we had the construction professions, we had a large number of trade associations, we had individual firms from all parts of the supply chain represented there. This identified that there were 4 key areas on which they wanted us to do some work and provide guidance to the industry. Firstly, on skills and migration, where a few weeks ago now, the Construction Leadership Council actually published a report setting out some recommendations on what business should be doing to prepare for this, working within the new framework of migration rules that the Home Office has set out. So, for example, helping their employees who are EU nationals, who are long-term residents of the UK, specifically who've been here for more than 5 years, to apply for what's called settled status, which effectively gives them pretty much every right that you can have in the UK, bar the right to have a UK passport and the right to vote in UK elections. So you are able to live and work in the UK indefinitely, bring family members to join you, etc. Or for those who haven't been in the UK for 5 years, something called pre-settled status exists. The idea is that this should form a natural pathway into being able to obtain settled status in due course, and I think that's eligible for pretty much any EU national who is currently living and working in the UK and who intends to remain for any period of time. At the same time, the CLC has been making a lot of representations, working with some of the bigger trade associations to the Home Office about what occupations should be included on the shortage occupations list to make sure that Brexit doesn't precipitate a crisis in terms of skills within the industry. And they're also actively working with the Home Office, again in partnership with some of the trade associations, to discuss how we can make some of the issues, some of the proposals within the immigration white paper that the Home Office published around things like the temporary workers programme, and also around the process for getting clearance to bring in nationals from overseas as migrant workers, easier for firms, particularly SMEs, to navigate. So trying to find practical ways and means of enabling people to comply with the rules that the Home Office wants to apply as easily as possible. Some of those areas I think are a little bit more advanced than others. I think we made good progress in relation to the shortage occupations list. In relation to some of the other things that they're looking at in terms of how you would support firms to engage with the system, I think that's going to be more of an ongoing discussion. But the Home Office is consulting on all of these issues, so the industry's got the opportunity to make representations. The second area that we've been looking at is on the movement of goods. I won't talk about this too much because it's quite complex and technical, but what we have done is publish an awful lot of guidance on the .gov website about what firms need to do to register with HMRC, how they should manage things like customs declarations, VAT declarations, and issues such as that. The CLC has circulated information on that, and we've also published that on our own websites, and a lot of trade associations have also published this guidance as well. So if you do trade overseas, you either import or you export, there is information that's readily available about what you need to do. The third area was the regulations that will apply. So regardless of the outcome of the negotiations, including no deal, all products that are currently certified and can be sold on the UK market will continue to be able to be legally sold on the UK market. For the foreseeable future, you will also be able to import any new products that have been certified and had their conformity assessed within the European Union and obtained a CE mark. That will be seen as conferring the right to be sold in the UK market. The biggest single change that people who produce products will see is that if they develop a new product in the UK, rather than being able to apply for a CE marking, at least in the short term, they will have to get something called a UKCA, UK Conformity Assessment Mark. That will enable the product to be legally sold in the UK, but will not enable it to be legally sold in the EU. It will have to be separately tested and have its conformity approved by a testing body within the European Union. So, again, apologies for getting into some of the technical details around that, but I think that is one of the few areas where the guidance that has been provided is very clear, it's very comprehensive, and it does set out what the situation is. Again, all of this information is available on the .gov website and via various trade association websites. And then finally, one issue that has come up, this probably doesn't affect the majority of people in the room, perhaps no one, but is very important for those people that it does. If you have customers overseas or you employ European Union nationals, then you will need to be very careful to make sure that you comply with data protection legislation and rules. This is probably one of those areas where people could most easily be caught out, certainly in the event of a no-deal Brexit, because it doesn't take a great deal to fall foul of the rules as set out in the data protection regulation. So I won't try and explain the complexities of that, but again, this is something on which there is quite a lot of information available. The CLC, when we circulated a brief on that, we did include a short summary of what the key points are, the key rules are, and we included some signposts, the guidance on that. That is all available on the CLC website, so I would suggest that you have a look at that because it will direct you to exactly where you need to go to on the .gov website, and that will explain, hopefully, pretty much everything that you need to know. I will stop there and let Rob have a go, but I'm staying around to answer any questions, so please feel free to fire any questions at me later in the session.
Okay, thank you, Fergus. Rob, over to you.
Thank you. I think start off by saying thanks for that. I think it's very comprehensive, explaining the process as well as what's going on at the moment, because it is, even for those of us that have to work alongside the civil servants and politicians, very difficult to grasp what's going on day to day when it's such a fast-moving environment. So my job is to set the backdrop of the industry, if you like, and drill down into the M&E sector and specifically the electrotechnical engineering services side of things to see how this might affect us in a no-deal scenario. I do want to touch on life before Brexit. Up here is stuff that happened to us in the last recession. It was an unusual recession, so I'm not saying we are going to enter into recession because of this. One of the dangers, I was speaking to somebody before we started, was that you talk yourself into recession. That is a significant risk of which we must avoid. But it is worth noting that in the last recession, bank lending dipped by 38% across the economy in construction, whereas across the rest of the economy it's only 5%. So funding very quickly dries up for companies in our area. So where do they go when they need money? Well, somebody paying you goes to trade credit, delaying your payment, which went out by 3 times as much as it usually did. And what we tend to do is rely on maintenance, sweating the assets, doing more of it, reactive and planned, to get us through that economic downturn, and for public sector spending. And that didn't happen because PFI from the 1990s had dried up. So it was a very different kind of economic drop. It was nearly 1.5, nearly 2% in terms of the GDPR drop in that sense. So we need to be very careful of that. Secondly, I wanted to paint the significance of what we are in terms of overall economic output. You'll see up there that we have roughly 10% of GDPR, 3 million jobs, construction, FM and infrastructure this includes. We are about 85, 90 billion in output, 122 billion on FM, going up to about 600 in terms of what we enable the rest of the economy to do. And I think that's something we miss. We tend to be quite insular and remember that we do things. But what we do, or what you guys do, providing built assets, maintaining built assets, helps the rest of the economy do what it's supposed to do. And before we stepped into this world of Brexits and referendums and everything, UK and government were stepping into quite a positive place. There was an industrial strategy being rolled out, a white and a green paper of Farmer Review in 2016. We were identifying gaps that we could close in greenhouse emissions, in economic trade deficits, the cost of construction, the digitisation programme. And this was all really about what I tend to summarise as almost making the UK the Silicon Valley to the EU. It was going to be the innovation hub, and it may still be able to occupy that space. But it was setting up the funding, the skills, all the infrastructure with HS2 and everything else. And we'd identified quite a large housing pipeline as well as an infrastructure pipeline that would sustain construction and maintenance through the years to come. The only real question for us was how we were going to do it. But in the last year, not just Brexit, in the last 18 months really, we've had Grenfell, Carillion. You see up there the insolvencies went right up in the last year because we see in the press every day that we live on wafer-thin margins and various other bits and pieces. So what I'm trying to do is paint the backdrop that we live in quite a fragile existence. This has been recognised both in not just in our industry and knowing what we know about all of our businesses around the room, but these quotes are taken from the Procuring for Value report and the sector deal for construction, where they talked about the fragility of the business model and the need to step away from purely transferring economic and legal risks for the sake of it, rather than collaborative supply chains and framework agreements. So there's that flavour of thinking about who you work for and why you're working for them, rather than just taking any old amount of work. I wanted to step into some myth busting. At the start of the Brexit issues as they arose, there were various camps and opinions about whether people bought overseas, China, EU, or employed non-UK nationals. The stats are that if currency drops, material price rises from the EU will rise, and then you've also got delays. I asked my colleagues in the employment team, do we know what percentage of the workforce in the engineering services sector is EU national? They said on a rough percentage, ballpark figure is 14%. And I said, and what figure do you think the average contractor employs direct labour workforce, as opposed to self-employed labour-only subcontractors or agency workers? They said, on average, 75% of workforce is directly employed. Here what you see is that 38% of exports, in terms of 38% of construction exports to these top 5 materials. Take out paint and wood, the rest is all M&E. Same for the imports, which accounts for 30%. Move to the next screen. You've got the fact that the EU is accounting for, I think it's 61% of our trade. And then you have figures around, yes, China's 17%, but we're still exporting largely to the EU as well as importing. So that's quite a reality check on whether you think you buy your goods and materials and plant down the road, but where it comes in from may still threaten your ability to deliver your project. And where I'm taking you is from that bigger picture through to the contractual structure. This is what you know. I'm teaching you to suck eggs here, but it's just, again, a reality check on the timelines, because I deal with the legal stuff, the contracts, the bit we always get to, which is another of the contracts for me, is the payment cycle. And in the world of mechanical and electrical contractors, it always starts off with, if you're buying anything big, you tend to have to pay up front. On delivery, the remainder of the balance. You can't claim under most contract structures until you install, then it's the end of the month, and then you start your Construction Act cycle, so you're looking at anywhere between 35 or the 120 days. That cycle, or that window of expenditure to revenue, can make your business models extremely fragile. Never mind the fact that you've quoted the job X number of months before acceptance, and it's a 12-month program based on a fixed lump sum price. So we don't think about inflation because our contractual structures don't allow us to. But it's worth thinking about it now more than ever, is what I'm trying to say when I go into these issues. So what have we done? The packs you've got on your chairs have got a fairly lengthy Brexit document called a risk assessment. which explains some of the process Fergus was alluding to, repeats some of the data that I put up there, and then enters a risk assessment that you can do on your business and your supply chains. And you also have a different document, which I'll go into in a second. This is just encouraging members to look at their businesses, go through, where do I get my funding from? Do I have parent companies which may be foreign-based or in tax havens? Are there issues with currency fluctuations from there? Do I need to look at where I get my labour from, even if it's the non-directly employed, as well as the directly employed? Where do I get my products from? Which wholesalers am I using? Can I ask them for their statements about how they're going to handle Brexit? And even with, if you think about a completely different issue, BIM, just-in-time delivery, off-site manufacturing, we're supposed to be dealing with these issues of goods, materials, as and when they're available. That may make it pretty hard if people don't have stocks. And the conversations we're having with distributors and manufacturers at the moment are more around exactly that, what they hold, where in the country, and what will that availability look like for you. I wanted to address a pretty fundamental issue about contracts. There has been some conversations almost weekly with me where somebody says, can't we just rely on force majeure? For those of you that don't know, that's supposed to be interpreted from legalese into acts of God. So it's natural disasters, storm, tempests, and various other things that I never necessarily see in my lifetime. Brexit is not an act of God, no matter where you stand on the issue. And I can't think which one wants to be God at the moment. But it doesn't fall within the legal definition of the contract. It is something you've, in theory, from a contractual perspective, had 2 years to foresee, manage, and deal with. The reality is that's fairly impossible for the smaller contractors. But, so you won't be able to get away with force majeure. So we step into the second part. You assess your business, but what about assessing your actual supply chains? I mean, when we do commercial awareness seminars, we try and encourage you guys to figure out who you prefer to work for anyway. Is it framework agreements, maintenance agreements? Who are your main wholesalers? Can we agree volume discounts? All those kinds of things that create a more stable business environment for you to trade in. But actually, there is some worth in going through the actual contract clauses that you regularly sign up to. And I appreciate that my job here in that contract review process tends to be the anally retentive one that goes through line by line and highlights every risk. So you on the commercial side of that process will drop a percentage of my comments and negotiate the other percentage. But some of these issues have a different dimension now. No one ever looks at change of law clause or statutory requirements clause, whether it's in a JCT, an NEC or a bespoke. You might want to now. See which way that risk goes. See how it's going to affect you. Termination at will clauses. We can terminate, I did one yesterday, to terminate you on 7 days for no reason whatsoever. I mean, I objected to that anyway because it doesn't give us time enough to wrap up and redivert resources to other places without losing profit in the business. We want to give ourselves maybe a month, 3 months on that so we can have a genuine look at it. But it might also be our get out. If the contract price has no way of index linking it and the price of things fluctuate that much, then that might be our get out if it's a mutual clause where we can terminate it as well. So try and go through the contracts to the extent that you can and say these are now a higher priority issues than they were in our business, and we need to start thinking about how they may affect us. Just to tell you how the main standard forms affect you, so JCT and NEC, if you think there's anything in them that will help you on Brexit, broadly, they probably won't. As I say, force majeure will not help you. Fluctuation options A, B and C in JCT are now in the schedules. You can use them, but I have not in my 16 years seen anybody do anything other than put a line through them and take them out of the contract. They would only give you an index link to the price of what you're providing. They would not give you an entitlement to extra money beyond inflation. So if something caused you cost in terms of delay in getting kit into the country to the site, or your wholesaler having delay, you would be not entitled to recover those costs under direct loss and expense claims, or time. Doesn't give you that. You can insert it as an amendment, and NEC likewise compensation events determine whether you get time or money. There is nothing in there that strictly gives you the ability to get it. Option X1 and X2 give you the ability to link to inflation. So on the first 4 of the pricing contracts. So again, you do have the ability to sit down, and there are main contractors going 2 different ways at the moment. There are some saying, not our risk, we'll pass it down. But I think worthy of note in this week's construction press is Osborne, who turned around and said, no, we need to take an intelligent conversation with the end client as to how we're going to share the risk of this. So this is quite a significant issue for suppliers in wrapping up their tenders, and they can see it that it will hit them, and if their suppliers went bust on them because this hit that hard, it would jeopardise everybody's business as well as the project delivery in the first place. So what have I come up with? Because I've been asked a few times on individual inquiries, what can we do to deal with this? And I will quote a member who was, let's say, in the vicinity of the Honda announcement, when he came to me and said, we need something that will allow us to carve out the ability to fluctuate the price of the materials. He was more concerned about materials than labour, but he principally had a concern about both. So we drafted something called a force municipal clause, which acts in the same way as a force majeure, in that it allows the parties to claim back the price fluctuation in materials, goods, plant, equipment, or labour, and the costs of delays incurred as a result of those, where they're beyond the reasonable control and they occur after the date on which we entered the contract. Definition. I'm not going to read that out. You can read. It's wide. That's my point. It covers all decisions by sovereign, regulatory authorities, public. Any way I could describe a municipal authority, I put it in. What does it do? And this is the one on your chair. This is the second lighter document you've got, which is the Brexit Statement. It gives him, the contractor that was asking me for advice, the right to say, we'll bid for this job. And on the way, he said to me, Rob, before you were around in the industry, there were 4-hour windows at one point where the copper market was fluctuating so fast and furiously. He said, we could only leave a tender open for 4 hours at a time. He said, so we need to keep that in mind this time, that we can price based on whatever fixed agreement we can get with our suppliers. He said, and we can only leave that tender open for a set period. He said, we can't continue to let tenders extend as we revise quotes and value engineer things until they're 9 months old, and then we enter into the contract. He said, and I need something in there that says, right, so if any of those events happen within the definition of force municipal, we've got the rights to claim back the additional cost, the right to suspend the works, get paid for everything we've done to date prior to the suspension, and if the suspension rattles on for too long, let's face it, it's not going to do either of us any good. We can stick a notice in, tell them that this has happened, and agree to part ways by termination. He said, and that's the most sensible thing he could think of. So rather than me sitting on an ivory tower here or telling you what I think you should do, this came from one of your peers in the marketplace. He just wanted to use me to help him put the right legal words together in terms of the drafting. The copy of the actual clauses and everything that we sent out is what you've got on your chairs. Just a quick advert, our website, what we tried to do, and I said I thank Fergus and his team that have been extremely efficient, week by week passing information to us. on the copyright issues and the intellectual property, the product regulatory issues. We've started to build up a web page where you can download this stuff or hot link straight through to the government guidance. So if you want to go onto your ECA website, you can find that. JCT, NEC, you can amend it with the force municipal clause, you can put it in there. How hard you push ultimately on all this stuff is going to be a commercial decision for you. For those that always say to me, if I did everything you do, say, Rob, I'll never win any work and I'll go out of business. I realise that, I genuinely do. But I don't want you to go out of business because you didn't push at all. And you rolled over, signed a contract without reading it, and all the risk is on you. And in a worst case scenario about what we painted so far, the conversations where I said to wholesalers, distributors and suppliers say they are already incurring cost problems. Our state of trade survey, which covers the entire UK, both mechanical and electrical, so the low turnover has crept up slightly this year across the UK. Materials and goods has also crept up at least by the same amount. So margins have been squeezed. And therefore we just want to ensure your survival. You're a resilient, quite agile industry. And I think I'm going to leave it there and open us up to questions.
Just before we go to questions, but firstly, thank you. Can I just ask, you've both touched on product in the context of imports. When we attended the no-deal contingency planning event, there was a suggestion around the time frame that products could actually get delayed. I don't think, Fergus, you mentioned that. Has that evolved any more since then, or was that figure, I think it was 9 months of that order was suggested. Has any more thought gone into that?
Talk about
Delay to products being
for
imported.
which there would be potential disruption.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about it. It is, for obvious reasons, very, very hard to come up with accurate estimates about the potential risks of delays caused by inadequate customs infrastructure, the introduction of new procedures, IT system failures and things like that, as a result of a no-deal Brexit. We have been doing some evaluation of where we think the biggest risks are, and we have also been doing some assessment as to what we think the potential duration of these delays would be. I think the first point to make is that the biggest risk of disruption is to traffic that crosses the Davis Straits, either through the Channel or by roll-on, roll-off ferry. That is where the risks are greatest, and it is the transport link that is likely to be the one that suffers the highest level of disruption. If you do not send products through that link, across the Davis Straits, and actually the majority of firms in the construction sector use Tilbury, which is really the key piece of infrastructure in the UK, but there are also other East Coast ports in and on the side that could be another example. The risk of disruption is probably a lot less than it is if you're reliant on the Davis Straits. So if you could divert any shipments that you have to another port or to use another route, that would probably minimise the risk of delay that's likely. In fact, the biggest risk, I think, to the construction sector is probably that in an attempt to manage traffic across the Davis Straits, goods get diverted to other ports, and that has a consequential impact on the volume of construction products that they can process, because clearly a lot of the construction related products that come in are bulk products. It's things like timber, it can be cement, steel, things like that. There's a lot of it, it just takes time to process. If you reduce the amount of infrastructure dedicated to doing that, it will cause delays. In terms of the duration of these, the modelling that we have done ranges from around 3 months, or up to 3 months of significant delays, best case scenario, through to 6 to 9 months, worst case scenario. The assumption is that this would get better over time, but I think a sensible planning assumption for any firm would be 3 to 6 months worth of disruption in the event of a no-deal Brexit. But it does depend on which link you use.
Thank you. Okay, now we've had a quick whistle through really, from the high-level picture right down to the detail of what to put into contracts in the case of covering for disputes We're happy to take questions on anything within reason, as I said earlier on. So, but if you can keep it focused on construction, would be better. John?
Thank you. It's a question for Fergus, really. If what you say is likely to happen happens, in other words, Sweden makes the deal doesn't go through today, then we get the extension, and not the extension first, but between we get the vote that says that we're not going to have a no-deal Brexit. So we then go into full force, yes, we want to delay Brexit, but we can't do it in time. On the 29th of March, when Article 50 is triggered, what kind of status are we in whilst we're still negotiating that between then and April?
If we extend Article 50, exactly the same position that we are in now, we remain a full member of the European Union for the duration of that agreed period of time. It just moves the deadline, it doesn't change anything else.
And we can do that unilaterally.
We have to make the request. We can't do it. The only thing we can do is revoke Article 50 unilaterally. That's what the contribution to the European Union that we could do.
Yeah.
If you want to extend it, we need the agreement of all 27.
So that's my question then. If they can't get back to us in time, if you like, by the 29th, in order to give us a response, from the 29th onwards, what is our status at that point? What happens?
Well, if we haven't an extension, we fall out of the European Union unless we revoke Article 50. Does that answer the question?
It sort of does. So that means we go into a no-deal situation.
Yes.
In effect. Can we then, what if they agree at the end of April, for example, that we can have an extension to Article 50, do we fall back in again?
Tough. No.
Okay.
We're out.
Okay.
They would have to agree an Article 50 extension by the 29th of March.
So the option then would be to withdraw it completely.
If they didn't agree, that would be our option if you wanted to avoid a no-deal scenario. That is pretty much it.
Thank you.
Was that shock?
A very good question. In case of no deal, is there any chance that all the arrangements that at the moment are in place for EU employees, that they might be waived and there will be completely new regime in place? And I mean, all the agreements on the association will be approved at the moment of planning at the moment. Is there any chance it's going to change under a no deal scenario?
I could spend about half an hour answering your question, but to give you 2 or 3 points, if you have employees who are currently living and working in the UK, their status will not be affected. They will be allowed to continue to live and work here. Quite what happens if you have employees based permanently or temporarily in other member states within the European Union, it varies depending on the country, and you need to check the latest guidance about that. But in terms of EU citizens who are resident in the UK, you can continue to employ them. They will be living and working here entirely legally. The thing you need to do is to encourage them to apply for settled or pre-settled status as quickly as possible to get them on the system. And the Home Office has been running some pilots for this, and they've actually, so far, I think, granted 150,000 people settled status. So they've been moving quite quickly. I think the scheme opens properly to anyone who wants to apply at the end of this month. It's free, it's fairly quick, and a minimum amount of documentation is required, because what the Home Office do is essentially take the information you submit and then they cross-reference it to other government databases, such as the one held by HMRC, the criminal records one, and all of the rest of it. So, provided your employees are of good character, have paid their tax, have no criminal convictions, they should get their settled status or pre-settled status approved really quickly. The only thing to say to you as an employer is, you can't apply for them. They need to do it themselves.
Can I pick up on from that, Fergus? There was a suggestion about some limits that were set for low-skilled workers that were coming in afterwards. I don't want to take you into your half-hour explanation, but could you just pick up on that? We talked about MVQ3 and 30.
Yes. What has happened is that last year the Migration Advisory Committee, which is the independent committee that advises the Home Office on migration policy, published a report, and its recommendations form the basis of the migration white paper that I hope was published last year, which, as government white papers goes, a surprisingly readable and accessible document if any of you want to check it and find out what the future migration framework is going to look like. But a number of the recommendations that they made included that in relation to determining what a skilled worker was, which has a huge influence on the ease with which you can bring somebody into the UK, they were effectively significantly lowering the bar from what's called RQF, the Regulated Qualifications Framework, I think the details of the acronym, level 6, which I think was effectively degree level. They brought it down to what we call RQF level 3, which is essentially his MVQ level 3, A-level equivalent. A lot of people in the construction sector have said they think it needs to come down one stage further to MVQ level 2, because that's the norm in the industry for like people who qualified to work on construction sites, as sort of set out, and that's the approach taken in the construction skills certification scheme. But yes, and what the Migration Advisory Committee decided to do is say, well, we should scrap the 100,000 limit on skilled migrants each year, and we should reduce the bar in terms of what constitutes a skilled migrant to ensure that firms can find it easy to access the people that they need.
Any questions?
Yeah, I've got one, yeah. Just for you, Rob, really, with regard to, you talk about expenditure to income being 10 months. So we have, obviously, the tender jobs from tender to income is probably 36 months. Just with regard to fixed costs and indices that are being recognised by main contractors and clients for potential use now when we're trying to put fixed costs to bids. I've got bids that we're not starting until 2020. Is there any sort of outline indices that are being recognised or considered by clients, contractors?
So what used to happen was, again, before I was in the profession, there was something which was run by the government. It was a magazine printed with the Building Cost Information Service. That's now run by RIBA, and they've got a website. You do have to subscribe to the service, but it gives you all the data for 10-year periods, for year-by-year periods on different types of equipment and labour. So it will tell you whether it's sprinkler systems or electrical or various bits and pieces of kit, what formula you apply. And in a JCT contract, option C is a set formula. I think it's option X2 or 1 under NEC. And it's a QS's job really to go through and apply that month by month, where you have the ability to vary the price. Maintenance contracts, you see it all the time where there's just an annual price review, and the whole thing uplifts based on either RPI, CPI or BCIS. But it's just making sure that you're pinning the price, with the constituent parts of the price that you get away with, to an indexation, in some form of indexation. Because your only other option is, as I'll call him John, the member who rang me and said, well, the only other thing I've got to do is back like the old days, and you've got 4 hours to accept the tender or else it's pulled. But I've not seen that in my profession. I've seen the tender period shortened to weeks, but my norm for somebody that reviews thousands of contracts is that a quote is issued maybe a month or 3 months open for acceptance. There's a value engineering period where they basically try and bring it down to the place they want in order to get the job, and that can take another 3 months past the tender period. And if the main contractor comes back and says, right, we like the price, is your purchase order? No one blinks. They say, yeah, all right, we'll do the job, we'll start on Monday. By then, that price is already 6 months old. It's a 12-month programme, so you're still invoicing or applying for payment in month 11 or 12 based on prices that are 18 months out. At this, we're just putting that against the backdrop of imports, exports, potential reduction of labour, and thinking maybe we can't afford to be that flippant or complacent about how we price things at the moment.
working.
I've got a question. You focused a lot on the cost of materials. What about cost on labour? Because that seems to be a bigger impact on our industry at the moment than the materials.
So you can, again, under the JCT, I think it's option B is labour, for fluctuations, bring in the cost of labour, and that will cross-reference, a bit like day works, back to the national agreements for each sector. So in our case, it'd be JRB and those national agreements and those set levels. What you tender for, I mean, to get those right, the wage rates come out the national agreements into the day work system. They add back all the costs to the employer, pensions, etc., and they come out with an hourly rate which equals a day work rate. When you tender, as you will know, you then put a percentage uplift to reflect your individual cost of employing that person. So that if you're allowed to charge works on that basis, it's basically like a time basis. And that's the only thing you would link your fluctuation price to, is the cost of labour. There's been, Fergus will probably agree with me in this, hope. There's been quite a diverse reaction across the wider construction sector as to what level of different types of trades, geographically, what types of contractors are employing EU nationals, are going to feel a pinch. Some people's directly employed labour force is much higher than 75%, it's going to be 98%. Others have said they've got an EU workforce of probably 80%, because they're London-based and it's much higher. So there's quite a more fluctuating picture. There are stories being given to me that people went home for Christmas and didn't come back.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the distribution of migrant workers across the construction sector in the UK, somewhere between probably 11 to 14% of the workforce overall are migrants, but they are incredibly heavily concentrated in London and the South East, where the share of the workforce, well, the Office of National Statistics think it's 27%, but they admit their labour force survey underestimates the numbers. They know, just because of the methodology, it doesn't work for a sector like construction with a highly mobile transient workforce. The real figure, as far as we can tell based on surveys of employers, is for your larger contractors working on commercial and infrastructure projects, probably somewhere between 30 and 40% is the norm on any given site. In the house building sector, it's over 50%, and you do see foreign nationals overrepresented in certain trades like carpentry, joinery and bricklaying, as well as general labourers. But actually, interestingly, at the other end of the spectrum in relation to the professions, you could make the same argument about surveyors and architects. You have a very high level of foreign nationals employed in those professions as well. So it's one end of the industry to the other. Civil engineers and project managers are also professions where you actually see quite a high level of migrant workers employed. So if they all left, you're going to see a lot of disruption. It will affect different firms, different sites differently, but without a shadow of doubt, there would be a huge impact, particularly in the London area.
And that's a kind of vicious cycle that if currency goes down, there's not enough. If you're here to send money home, it doesn't represent the same value in sending it home. So do you stay, do you go home, or and the less labour in the market, the less supply there is, so the price goes up. But yes, there is the force municipal and the fluctuations option will deal with that in terms of what you can do in your contracts.
Thank you. Gentlemen, just to know about that.
Very, very quick one. EU directives, standards and general good practice, perspective of engineering and health and safety predominantly, are we going to carry on the good work with the European Union, or are we going to burn the bridges if you like, do our own thing, or what's the notion there at the moment?
In the short term, no change. In the medium to longer term, I don't know. But certainly for the next year or two, I don't think there will be any pressure to change anything at all. I think we'll have enough other things to be getting along with prior to changing any rules. And actually what happens in the long term would ultimately, assuming we leave the EU, be heavily influenced by the nature of the future economic agreement with them. The further that we diverge for the EU on standards and regulations, the harder it's going to be to negotiate a trade agreement with them. Simple as that. So there are going to have to be trade-offs made.
More questions?
As always in our industry, we seem to focus entirely in one direction, which is looking at our risk, our cost. But what's been done in terms from the government's point of view in terms of the clients and their behaviour? You know, so in many cases, I'm sure we all have clients enforcing terms and conditions that are just unreasonable, government included as well. So what's the plan there?
I mean, I guess government has two roles in this, doesn't it? Government as client, public sector as client, and then what we do in relation to the regulatory framework that affect other clients. In relation to the former, I think government is trying to improve the way that it contracts with the industry. If you look at a number of organisations, bodies like Network Rail, Highways England, they've tried to introduce better payment practices. They're doing much more to interrogate the supply chain and what goes on in it to try and make sure that small firms aren't being mistreated and disadvantaged in one way or another. We are also looking into things like the new framework contracts that the Crown Commercial Services brought out earlier this year. We've tried very much to practice what we preach in terms of shifting the emphasis away from looking for lowest cost and continually trying to drive down costs and transfer legal risks to what we hope will be a better framework. So it specifically says within the new construction frameworks that when you're assessing bids, 75% of the marks available for that assessment should be about the quality of what's happening. Only 25% should be the price. And we are also taking steps to introduce new rules for our contractors, so payment performance monitoring, taking that into account when awarding contracts. So I think government is moving in the right direction in terms of its own behaviour as a client, but I would just make one point. Government is not monolithic. When we say government, what we really mean are at least 5 or 6 central government departments that procure directly. We're then talking about probably 20 major procuring agencies which sit under them. I mean, the Department for Transport's got 4 or 5 itself, if you include things like the HS2, which is not quite a public body, but in terms of government accounting, but to all intents and purposes is. And then you have some of those organisations as well which sort of sit on the periphery with things like the regulated industries. Yes, okay, they're technically private companies, but they're heavily influenced by what the regulator wants, and the regulator tends to look to government and say, well, this is acceptable behaviour in these particular areas, and this is how we expect that you will behave. In relation to what we're doing with... So I just wrap up and say about government, saying it's a big task. Trying to get government to move together on this is not an easy thing to do. And we're probably still a few years from where we really want to be, but hopefully we're heading in the right direction. In relation to private sector clients, there is a limited amount we can do to condition their behaviour. The main things that we've introduced are their requirements on them to report on their own payment practices and performance every 6 months. So hopefully at least people will have better information about how the people they're proposing to undertake contracts for are actually behaving. And there is some evidence that this is starting to have an effect. And Build UK has its scoreboard. The average time to pay reduced by 3 days over 6 months. Okay, it's not brilliant. The industry is still an outlier in terms of its overall payment performance, but it's starting to move in the right direction, and actually some individual firms on that scoreboard improved their payment performance markedly. You saw improvements in 10 days plus in 1 or 2 cases. So I think some of the things that we're doing are going to have a positive impact on behaviour, and hopefully will help the industry become more sustainable, but being realistic about it, there is going to be a limited amount that we can do when it's private sector organisations or individuals spending their own money.
If I may add to that next question, when we attended the contingency planning event that Fergus referred to earlier, looking specifically at no deal, I took with me 3 CEOs from our largest major contractors, and that was the point that was on their mind, particularly in terms of how are they going to deal with the inevitable disputes and claims and time delays and everything else that follows from things being stuck in ports or low skills availability further up the chain or wherever it may be. The worrying thing in response to a number of questions in that area was the main contractor's view, not being malicious, but was simply that we don't know what to do here, so as things stand, we will bear it and pass it on. And that was pretty much the words used, so business as usual. There was, however, an acceptance that that could cause complete chaos. What we suggested after the conference was that the Construction Leadership Council has a work stream that deals with the business model, the procurement side in particular. And we suggested that just like the skills side was looking at the immigration issue, the procurement side should look at this issue, and we should as an industry try to decide and do something positive about this situation. So we engage with clients and say to them, you can't penalise us for things that are out of our control. When is the Construction Leadership Council meeting? Next week? Is this
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. We're told, we've written to them again since we're told it's on the agenda. So we're hopeful that something constructive can be discussed there, because the contracting industry at least needs to come together, preferably collaboratively with the clients to say, let's understand and let's try to do something constructive about this rather than just ending up in the inevitable fight that we would end up in if we did nothing at all about it. So hopefully we'll get something positive out of that discussion.
I think the biggest thing for me is how do you portion risk? It seems to me that the larger the organisation, the more pressures apply to the risk, as we all know. And it's kind of an attitude that the organisation take it. And that's fundamentally wrong where not companies probably know who are working on it. But I think for me that's a key message.
More questions? It was a long way to walk in bad weather. Should ask some more questions.
I mean, just adding to that, I think the market will harden up contractually. I think if I was a main contractor, and you never blame them for what they do because it's part of the intermediary position they're in the food chain. I would do the first thing. I would not upset the customer. I would prefer to upset my supplier. But if my supplier says no, it is only live for 6 months, 3 months, whatever the price window is, then I would be forced to talk to the customer about how we share that risk and have that adult conversation, as I always describe it.
It's a skills question. The electrical sector has largely looked after itself when it comes to training people, and compared to most other sectors, done a reasonable job. But we are interested in what the broader construction sector is about. But my question, and it's mainly to Fergus, is the construction sector getting its act together in terms of having a more sustainable basis for training people from this country into the industry rather than relying on cheap imported labour, or is the junkie still looking for a fix?
The junkie's moved off heroin, he's on methadone, he's in a treatment programme and he's receiving counselling. But there's still a risk of relapse, is how I would sum up the situation. I think we have made quite a lot of progress over the last couple of years in this area. I think the reform programme that the Construction Industry Training Board has undertaken has made it a more focused strategic organisation that is better able to deliver its core mandate, which is developing skills, development of training frameworks and qualifications, and funding or part-funding industry to deliver those. I think some of the work that Mark Reynolds from Mace has been leading on the skills side has really driven some positive changes in terms of getting new apprenticeship standards agreed and approved by the Institute for Apprenticeships, enabling firms to spend the apprenticeship levy, training people to to get the qualifications that they need to work within the industry. And I think that the industry is doing a better job of marketing itself and giving people clearer pathways from, if you like, having the idea that they might want to work in this industry to identifying what course they might want to take, who can deliver it, and how they can get supported to be on it. That said, there are clearly some things that do still need to be addressed. I think the biggest single problem that the industry faces is in recruiting people. Bear in mind there is a dwindling pool of younger people coming onto the job market, and it's a pretty competitive job market. Lots of firms in lots of sectors are looking for people, and the industry still does a terrible job around managing the transition from training into employment. And the CITB's estimates around the attrition rate at that point are absolutely horrific. About a third of people who are undertaking training in one or other construction occupation are not ending up in the construction workforce. So you're actually almost doing the difficult bit, but then you're not picking them up and recruiting them and retaining them within the industry. And then on the retention point, I think the industry has to do a lot better than it's currently doing in relation to retraining workers within the workforce, because the reality is that the bulk of people who are going to be working in the construction industry in 10 to 20 years' time are probably already working in the construction sector, but what they're probably not doing at this point in time is the job that they're going to be doing in a decade or 2 decades' time. So yeah, I think we've made progress, but the reality is that it's probably going to take us another 4 or 5 years or so to get to the point that we would ideally like to be. But some of the numbers move in the right direction. The construction industry has bucked the trend in terms of the overall number of apprenticeships that it's supporting, which at a time of pretty considerable economic uncertainty is not bad, and it's certainly better than the industry has done in parallel situations in the past. So there are some positive signs, some areas to work on.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Yeah, could you just reiterate with the points you made earlier? If Parliament votes for an extension, it's up to the EU to say yes or no.
Well, if Parliament votes for an extension, the government would have to formally request an extension from the EU, which I think means taking a specific proposal to the European Union. Then the 27 other member states would have to agree to that unanimously.
If they don't,
Then,
doesn't happen.
yeah, we'd fall out of the EU.
And it's all over.
Well, we would leave the European Union if they didn't agree to it. But I suspect that scenario is unlikely.
It's kind of like me handing my letter of resignation to Steve and then changing my mind. And Steve says, no, you're done. Your 3 months is up, out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unlikely that the European Union would want Britain to leave without a deal. I can't see that it's in their interests. I would have thought that it's more likely the haggling would be around the duration of the extension to the Article 50 period and the purpose for which they will be asked to agree an extension. And I think the EU's concern would be to have some form of assurance that this isn't just going to become a self-perpetuating cycle where the UK's never quite not out of, well, it never quite makes the final decision, does it want to be in, does it want to be out. This cycle just keeps repeating itself and there's a series of extensions. And the EU have indicated that that's not what they would want to see. But I suspect they would agree to a request for an extension rather than have the UK leave when they do.
But then it could go on for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
Due to the elections in Europe.
The European elections that need to form the Commission.
Would we have to have people standing now? Because we're still in the EU.
Yes. Well, yes and no. The constitutional problem is that to be a member of the European Union, you are under a legal requirement
requirement to send representatives to the European Parliament. Quite how you do that isn't actually specified. So your options would range from running elections in the normal way and voting for MEPs, through to potentially trying to agree some sort of bespoke deal where existing UK MEPs continue to represent the UK. And someone actually, and I don't know whether this is possible, but I have heard the idea floated that MPs in Westminster could also represent the UK in the European Parliament. And there is no legal bar to them doing that. You've previously had MPs who've also been MEPs at the same time. So it's a big problem, and it's one that would require a solution from the point at which the European Parliament starts to sit in about June. It's not an insuperable problem, I don't think.
Still a lot of shocked faces. Any more questions for Fergus or Rob? Okay. Well, I think the guys said they're going to hang around if someone has a question they want to take up personally. But just to remind you that there is a lot of information on the ECA website. We will be putting stuff out through Source and various other means. And the helpline stand ready to help anyone. So please do feel free to get in touch with us directly and look out for that information. All that remains for me to do is firstly to thank our two speakers, Fergus and Rob. If you could join me in also to thank you for coming out on a pretty horrible day and find your way here. We do appreciate it. And given the downbeat nature of this, I'll just leave this with you, just maybe to cheer things up. I'll share with you my son's solution to this problem. And he couldn't really work out what was going on, scratching his head. He said, "Dad, why don't they just put an England football manager in charge to sort it out?" And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, they'll have us out of Europe in no time." Gentlemen, have a safe trip.